Hello, this is Evan, the Get It Together Man. This video is going to be us assembling the Crownhill 13 by 11 hardtop gazebo with wood posts by Hampton Bay. I'm going to describe the process we use to complete this gazebo in about half a day with 2 people. The tools you're going to need are 10mm socket driver, 17mm socket driver, handheld wrench, which the kit comes with a pretty bad handheld wrench that would work in a pinch, but if you got your own, that's probably better. Phillips driver and some Allen key drivers, I think 4, 5, and 6 size Allen key wrenches or driver. There's the hardware there, and we're still unboxing and getting things set up. Okay, now that we've got everything basically unboxed and set up, we're going to start with steps 2, 3, and 4. Here's what the book says about those steps. It's building the cross beams basically. My helper and I usually split up, each doing 2 short sides and 2 long sides, each across the table like this. Table's set end to end with the pieces on it. See, my helper is getting the hardware set up while I'm showing you the book here. These boards here are going to take some T-nuts, and the T-nut is supposed to go on a piece of the board. I believe it's called a lap joint, but you can see there the notch of the board is hanging over there. So yeah, right there, you want to put a board underneath there when you're hammering in the T-nut so you don't break the board. When you're threading the bolts into the T-nuts, I think it's a good idea to get it started with your finger and then drive it with the impact driver there. That prevents it from getting cross-threaded. When you start it with your finger, you can tell if it's going nice into the threads. Sometimes when you put that T-nut in the wood, it's not exactly perpendicular to the wood and it's easy to get the bolt cross-threaded, so it's just a good idea to start it with your hand before you use the tool. Alright, now we're going to take the 2 long boards we just made and attach them to each other with wood screws. And I'm using a clamp here at each of the joints to get the boards flush with one another and then put the screws in. So you see I'm working my way down to each place where there's a joint in the board. Make sure they're nice and flush with each other. Now we're getting ready to put the cross beams we just made onto the legs. We're going to do a couple steps here in a slightly different order than what it says in the book. See what I mean? But we're getting the tables set up parallel to one another instead of perpendicular. All 4 posts in this kit are the same. Sometimes there's a left and a right post, but you don't have to worry about that with this. So see here, we're going back to step 1 with the bottom plates on the posts. We're also getting the hardware set up to put the cross beams on. And this step here where it talks about putting the corbels on, which is step 7, it says to do that later. We always do it at this step here. And we use the square to make sure it's nice and perpendicular. You'll see what I mean. This is where I went to get my square. Make sure the legs are perpendicular with the cross beam. It's a perfect 90-degree angle, and then I tighten everything down once we check for square. Now we're getting ready to stand up the first set of legs and cross beam. This wood here that we're using to brace it up with the clamp is wood that we brought from home. You'll probably need a clamp that can span about 10 to 12 inches, and you want the bracing lumber to face opposite directions to make sure your piece stays up while you're working on the second pair. Here's a little bit closer up view of how we're attaching the cross beams and the corbels and how we square it up. Here you can see how we're bracing up the second pair, and we're using the long beam on the ground there as a spacer to know how far apart to set the pairs so that we can lift them up now and do the exact same process that we did with the beams laying on the table, but now we're up in the air on the long side. We usually set up the short side of the gazebo with the braces and then do the long side up in the air like this. Now we're going to put the brackets on the top of the post that will hold up the metal roof. And now it's time to start assembling some stuff for the metal roof. There's a box here for the vent, there's some brackets to put on the upright pieces, and the ridge cap assembly itself. This part is definitely a two-person operation. The way the angle pieces there are, they'll sort of hold up this box, but it's better to have two people there just to make sure. And then here goes the ridge cap assembly, and it just drops down into the brackets there, takes the bolt. Still way easier with two people for sure. I think in the instructions, these support pieces that we're putting on now, it says to screw them into the wood, but we're not doing that yet. We're gonna let the other pieces that we'll put on later act as a spacer to make sure they're actually in the right position, and then before we put the roof panels on, we'll add the wood screws for these pieces. Attaching the screws in the corners of this box was a little tricky here. You can see us trying to figure out what tool to use, and we ended up on a small socket wrench with a 10 mil socket on it. I was trying to figure out a way to do it with my driver, and that just was not working with the way the angle is. So you want to make sure you have a small socket wrench for this part. Here's the picture from the book. You can see how tight that angle is, and it's hard to get a tool in there and attach those bolts. Now we're going to start actually putting roof panels on. These are all individually wrapped in some thin styrofoam / plastic. So we're going to get those laid out and unwrapped first, and then we can start putting them on. You'll need a fairly tall ladder for this part. The one I'm using here is probably about 6 feet tall at the highest rung when it's in the A-frame position, and that's just about the smallest the ladder could be to get this done, depending on how tall you are. It'd be a little safer probably to get a taller ladder, so that you can get up high enough to see where the bolts go through the roof panels and into the structure of the gazebo. I'll show you what that looks like a little closer up on some of the lower row of roof panels. But right now I'm getting the top section of the bridge cap section of the roof done first. While I'm doing that, my helper is going to start putting up the curtain rod around the perimeter of the gazebo. Once all 4 sections of that top roof section are complete, it has this ridge cap for 5 sections that cover the top bit and the diagonal seams. That's what I'm putting on now. Getting the bolts up through the bottom of the ridge cap and into the top requires 2 people usually. One person to get it lined up and the other person to drive the bolt from underneath. This bottom rail or the roof assembly is pretty cool. In the corners it just notches in, and then in the middle of each side it takes a couple of bolts. You can see in a moment here how that piece I just put on pops out of the notch in a second here, but it's easy to just pop back in. And now that we have all the bracing pieces and the basic skeleton of the roof assembled, we are putting the wood screws into that bracket in the middle perpendicular section there. And now we're talking about positioning so that we have room to work around the outside to put up one big section and one little section of roof. As you're putting these roof panels up, I recommend not tightening down everything until you get at least the middle section up, and those plastic plugs that I just showed go into the top of the panel and bolts go through the panel in the bottom. But you want to make sure those plastic plugs are installed before you tighten down all the bolts, because sometimes those holes do not line up exactly right. Now that we have one big section and one little section of the roof complete, and don't forget to put the ridge cover on the diagonal side there, and that's what my helper's getting ready to do. But we're getting ready to move it over closer to the railing and away from the house so that we have room to work on the other side. We like to put the side of the roof on first. That's gonna be hardest to get to later. Just depends on what your space is, which, whether you do the left or the right or the front or the back first. And now here's what I was talking about earlier. I'm showing you how the bolts go through the panels into the lower railing there. And I'm just getting them finger tight and getting them all up there first. And then I'll put those plastic plugs through the holes in the top of each panel and then tighten everything down. Here I'm having a bit of trouble getting the plastic plug in through the hole, and it gets a little mashed and bent sometimes, but they send 1 or 2 extras, so if that happens, take the broken one out and try again with the new one, and that will usually work. And here's a closer view of what it looks like to put the ridge cover on. Take some longer bolts with a plastic washer on each. This is a similar process for the small roof up there as well. Here's the page in the book showing what I just did. And that is pretty much it for this gazebo. The last page talks about anchoring this to the ground. It shows there the gazebo assembled in the grass next to a tree. And it comes with some tent stakes to put it in the ground, but I do not recommend doing that. I would recommend building this gazebo on a deck like we have here, or a concrete slab, and using something like lag screws or concrete anchors to actually secure it to your surface. In this case, the client was going to do that himself later, so we didn't actually attach it to this deck, but I do not recommend building this structure directly on grass. If you live out of the St. Louis area, I hope this helps you assemble your own gazebo, and if you live in St. Louis, please look me up on my website, getittogetherman.com, and hire us to come put together your gazebo or your swing sets or anything some assembly required. Have a great day.